So I think when most people think about craft, what they think about, hopefully anyway, things like skillfulness, ingenuity, the crafting of high quality objects. It's all about skills honed over time, a process of trial and error, experience, a familiarity with a material maybe. It's about perhaps instant recognition of a tool in a hand, the deeply intuitive bodily gestures, the muscle memory. Perhaps that moves your leg, maybe your arm, and leads the eye. It's a practice, ultimately, that is refined. I also think that these same things, these skills, these ideas, these competencies exist not just with making things, but critically in my case here, using things. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So for me anyway, using things, well, it's all about tending, it's about caring, it's about maintenance, it's about living specifically things that I do with clothes, with garments, with fashion. It's about living with things, with all things, through time. It's also about the art and practice of noticing, something that probably isn't cultivated as much as it should be, and about a reconnection of people and their goods, the stuff that they have. So some of the things that I'm going to show you, and many of the images, the vast majority of the images in this case, are photographs of the public, gathered over an 8-year research project where I talk to everyday people about the sorts of things they do when they're using clothes. And it's actually very difficult to elicit from people stories of use. They would go, well, what do you mean? How do I use it? Well, I have no idea what you mean. And you realize actually when you ask people about using things, they find it almost impossible to know what you mean unless you sort of dig a little further or just sit with them and figure it out over time. If I'd asked them about buying, they would have been away forever. But as soon as you ask them about using, there's no language, there's no visuals, there's very little that help people to figure out this whole huge body of activity that we all do, but that's unnoticed and unvoiced. And yet we do it, and many of us do it with wonderful skill, as I discovered. So the project went to 3 continents. I think it was 17 countries, and then, okay, so I'm from a design background, so then we did a load of design projects where we were trying to foreground use, trying to design things actively for purposeful use rather than just for sale, which quite frankly happens most of the time in fashion. So in many ways, this talk is a real departure from most people's understanding, conventional understanding of what craft is. So this is really sort of a sideways step, but nonetheless important. So the craft of use, as I call it, the craft of using things well, with pleasure, with delight, is something that is really widely shared. And it has the potential to grow more. Absolutely it does. Quite frankly, it's not earth-shattering. There's nothing in it that's going to make everybody stop and think, okay, this is the next big thing. But therein lies its power, because it's achievable, widespread, in the reach of us all. Perhaps its transformatory potential is that it speaks in a different register about what we must do. It's a different type of engagement with the world. Not only that, but I think these craft practices, the craft of use, they're fairly independent of resources. You don't really need much money to use something well. You need to buy the thing in the first place, if indeed you're buying it. But then after that, it takes very little to use something with satisfaction and pleasure. But the thing that we do need is a sort of readiness and openness to embrace the radical potential of use over buying things. And that's quite a bold step in a world where we perhaps don't question the role of shopping, buying, particularly in my case. I will always come back to talking about clothes. Clothes, of course, the universal item that many people can relate to. I think what we need to do, quite frankly, is to engage differently with the world, and using can become a movement of resistance of the forces of consumer culture. Craft here is not just another marketing label that differentiates a product and increases sales. It's actually something that completely can undermine many of these big problems that we have at root cause. So for these reasons, I would say it's an essential part of sustainability futures. And we've got quite a lot of work to do, let's face it. In 2009, a huge piece of research was done in Stockholm by the Stockholm Resilience Centre that identified 9 planetary boundaries, which, if transgressed, would lead to unpredictable instability in Earth systems. We've already transgressed 3 of them: climate change, as I'm sure you can imagine, the rate of biodiversity loss, and I think the rate of human intervention of nitrogen cycles. But this same report had a message of hope in it, and maybe today we need also to grab onto this. And they said that actually the hope comes from seeing the agency of knowing that actually we're not doomed if we manage to work within a safe operating space. And figuring out what that is and working within that space is the responsibility of us all. So the safe space in the case of fashion, I would say, is extraordinarily challenging because of the close association between fashion and consumerism. And I think you really do need to have a little bit of a time to see how closely wedded these things are to figure out what the challenge is for us all and how we can use craft perhaps to think about how to change that. So I would say, and then you can tell me at the end if you disagree, that the language and expression of the consumer society in the clothes that we buy, the clothes that we wear, is so overriding that we probably don't even notice it. The prevailing consumerist style, the story it tells us, the one in the magazines, the one in celebrity culture, is so natural to our way of thinking and our behaviour. So we just think it's normal to buy the way we do, exchanging money for products. It's expected that these same products will look a bit clunky, a bit out of date, out of fashion in maybe 6 months. And it's usual, isn't it, just to throw them away or at least to a charity shop rather than repairing them. So what we see is that purchase and disposal has sort of become a necessary component of modern living. Ideas of progress have become a societal narrative of growth through buying more clothes. Fashion is really, quite frankly, cut in the cloth of consumerism. And the different approaches to production and manufacture that we see today have really been shaped to suit the demands of the consumer market. There's an ideology of more and cheaper. For those of you who know Primark and who've been in, I mean, it is quite frankly eye-opening. I could have chosen a different word, I was careful. Cheap garments have changed consumption patterns in the UK in the first decade of the 21st century. Prices went down by 26.2%. In the US, it was by 17.3%. Prices are falling, people are buying more, the amount they're spending is roughly the same. Of course, part of this requires things to last for an increasingly short time so that you replace them. But this disposability is not, of course, purely in the quality of the making, the quality of the fibre. It's also in how they look. And what we see is an ideological and technological convergence, where political ideology, where consumerism, tightly bound together, shopping is pushed forward as a democratic choice. And at the same time, manufacturing systems, technological innovation is set up for standardized, high volume, low cost production. This shapes what we dress in. And it also leads to business providing us with those things. And everything that the fashion industry does ends up framing solutions in the same terms with which it's currently very familiar. And I hate this last bit, but this is really true. Even sustainability solutions, if you're interested in eco-fashion in any way, you will see that there are always new garments to buy that are offered. This is the way that solutions are developed. You know, over the last 20 years, there have been some great things that have happened in the fashion sector to reduce the environmental impact of the products that we see all around us. And I would applaud anyone in the room and everybody else who's not here who's done that work. And whilst they've been good and have delivered something which is quite remarkable, I would say on average every garment that you buy has a lower impact now than it did 20 years ago. So that's a great outcome. Yeah, actually, that's not so good when you look at the bigger picture, is that we're all buying more. So actually the problem is just worsening. What we see is attempts to lessen the impact of the fashion sector have been eroded simply by the increase in the number of garments in circulation. Things are getting worse, not better. The best intentions that people have just come up against the structures of unsustainability, as they're called. The current approaches just aren't working. They're too similar, they're too simple, they're too neat, they're not human scale. The list goes on. And what we see ultimately is that everyone's been focusing on the wrong things. It's not actually a question of the detail of what we're dressing in. It's about how we are dressing. It's about fashion culture. So this is something that if you're going to write anything down, I would write these next 5 lines down. So I got this from an amazing seminar I attended in Cambridge. Here they go. These are a group of eminent engineers and scientists who are on the top of everything to do with materials and demand reduction. And it starts off, 1/3 of the world's energy consumption comes from industry. But the efficiency limit that the best engineering can possibly deliver is 27%. So a small, 6% reduction in the amount of energy that we currently use. And these are the engineers that were saying this next line. This is perhaps why I wrote it down. The dream of a techno fix that permeates all our ideas is just that, a dream. The only solution we have to shift things is less stuff. And then their next line, technically, it's possible to live with fewer materials. So what I want to know is, what are some of the roles that craft and many of the skills that we're talking about here, not craft particularly, but the skills which it points to, what role can that play in this transition? It's a really big transition. So it's context that makes us, we need to hold that context, I think, to realize the urgency and the challenge, to marshal our resources so that we understand what needs to be done. And then, in the words of a wonderful American poet called Gary Snyder, once you've figured out where you are, what's the next thing you do? You stray. You stray off the path, you take a risk, you look in other places, and you really try to embrace other ways of knowing, other ideas, and you start essentially to experiment. So, different to the usual story, that's what we need to do. We can't continue to grow. What are the opportunities for clothing, for fashion, for craft, beyond consumerism? Oh, it's a thorny question, isn't it? So for 8 years, I did this project that was trying to look to see what that might be, to see if we could establish vectors of action around using things that spearhead a critique of contemporary culture, but don't in any way disempower us, enable us to keep moving in the way that I think people who talk about resilience, this is what they refer to. The project started from a very simple premise. It said, what if? So what if we gave attention to tending and wearing and living with garments through time So what if we did that as well as to creating them? What if we prized usership as much as ownership? What would happen then, both to us and to everything else? The craft of use, as it unfolded, ended up representing fashion, but mainly within the clothes that we already had. Use, as I ended up discovering, really is not dependent on producing and consuming more. It's not that using garments doesn't consume resources, it absolutely does. Of course, we're laundering, there's loads of energy. I mean, I'm not saying that in the slightest. But what is different about it is that it's not driven by the politics and practices of growth. It's driven by other things, largely around need satisfaction. So there are many, and these are all examples of many of the things that are gathered. This one is California, you can probably see from the sky. And this dark Britain, you can see. So, no, don't worry. No, don't worry. It was a good tone, it could have been. So many examples of the sorts of things that are going on really already exist. And also what I would say is that many of the things that we need to make happen don't necessarily contribute to the market. They reflect a reality that is rarely acknowledged. And certainly within fashion circles anyway, if you can't show some sort of result in sort of sales on the bottom line, then it doesn't really matter. But here we see a very vibrant set of fashion activity. I've got some stories from the photographs I'll tell you very briefly. This is Mr. Edwards. He is in his early 80s, and one of the things that he brought along was this jacket. Mr. Edwards came along and he described this as his three-stage jacket. It started out as a waistcoat, and it was quite tightly fitting. He said it was actually given to him. He put on a few kilos around the front, and then in order to be able to fasten it still, he took the bold step of taking a pair of scissors to the back, slitting it up the back, and knitting a panel down the back. Then he decided after about 10 years that, it needed something else, and so he set to and knitted a waistband, some sleeves, and a collar. And then a few years on, as obviously his desire to eat grew, he then couldn't fasten it, and so then he added some latchets, as he described them. I'd never heard the word before, across the front, and finished each one with a sequin. What we realised here is this man who wasn't a tailor, he was an engineer who did a bit of dancing in the evening. He was extremely fond of being photographed. But that's pretty much all I knew him. But what we saw is this remarkable ability to see potential in something and then to use some basic skills that he had and try them out and figure them out. And then the sense of pride, my goodness. Okay, here actually, I don't know quite why these are two older people, because actually the vast majority of the people were much younger in the group of people. But this is Jean, again in her 80s. She came along wearing the polka dot dress, which was given to her when in the 60s, she had a small family, 3 girls, and they were going on holiday to the south of France, and a neighbour said, "Oh, if you're going to Antibes, you really need to wear this dress." So she gave it to her. It was a great success, so she said, and such a success it's been that the dress is actively worn still by Jean and 2 other generations of women in her same family. So her 3 daughters, who you can see, and her 2 granddaughters still wear the dress. And they say, not a family party goes by without somebody wearing it. And you see the same resources working hard, in this case in a different way. And here maybe what it is, it shows a mentality of an awareness and a pleasure of using things and linking it to a completely different idea. This seeing the holding on to something, the longevity of a garment, maintaining a garment, of putting different values in it. this guy said, you know, this is just a regular jumper. I just bought it like in New York. I was like 18. And, you know, they're not an eco company. But, you know, I feel like I've forced them into being eco because I've kept it so long. It's like, oh. And so what you see is the ideas and of using things. Kate, come on, change the way that the power to affect garments. The other thing that became extremely apparent when talking to people about how they use things is that garments are really profoundly influenced by forces beyond design and production. If anybody's a designer in the room, one of the things that we're often told is how powerful design is. There are these figures that are bandied around, like 80% of a product's environmental impact is decided in design. Before production begins, we have so much power. And yet actually what you see that goes on beyond the point of purchase is a huge world that designers know very little about, quite frankly, and that hugely influences the garment and the sustainability potential of that. Sustainability is not, I would say, dictated by the intrinsic physical properties of a garment, but by our social system. It's a political, not a technical challenge. What we ended up seeing is that fashion was a shared enterprise, and what we began to uncover is a realization that you have to begin to acknowledge the contribution of others, and this is where the craft of using things well really comes in. It's about transforming things beyond the specification of a fabric, beyond the stitching of a seam. Psychology tells us that in its a theory that I recently discovered was called self-determination theory, that well-being is very much linked to a sense of competence that we feel in our activities, and also who they allow us to feel close to, and then also a sense that we have a choice about our actions. Further, it sort of says that the behaviours that we closely associate with a sense of satisfaction and well-being are those that take more effort and those that involve more interactions in relationships. It allows us perhaps to engage with the processes of an infrastructure of consumption, including through craft skills and practices, through also imagination and an active way of understanding things, through attention to other people in their genuine otherness. For many people, engaging with people and the things they do when they get things home and put them in their cupboards and on their kitchen tables is a very uncomfortable, unpredictable thought, because you don't really have control over it. There's no safety blanket in working in this way, and you have to tap into the complex, messy world of others and use them as a resource. But here, there's something that we've discovered is really nice, is that use meets industry, public good and private interest, and we recognise that the conditions that are there and we work with them. 5 minutes, okay. Right. So one of the things that we figured out when we were trying to talk to people about the skillfulness, the ingenuity of using things, is that there's a real shift from this focus on things to what we do, actions and activities, to practices. And we began to call the things that we do around these behaviours around using clothes something called usership. And here there's often, not always, a deep interest in materials. There's a sort of a reverence for that. It's sometimes framed as a new materialism. Perhaps we think that we're extremely materialistic culture at the moment, swimming in a sea of stuff, but the argument goes actually that we're not materialistic at all, because we don't really value the things that we have around us. So one of the things that we saw was an appreciation for things, perhaps more of an understanding of how things were put together. There's also a knowledge of caring for things, a preference given to maintenance. It's a word that's so inherently sort of unsexy, but actually the truth of it is that's the root of many of the things that we have to do. It's an authentic, mindful satisfaction with what we already have. One of the things that's often said is that if we can find a way to cultivate an interest in the things that we already have, we can get to the root of changing things. And here, what we're trying to do is to look at objects in the context of real lives, not commodities, but places of action and love and messiness and hope. So one of the essential requirements of sustainability is an engagement with an agenda of less. Evidence, of course, suggests that more is not necessarily making us happy. There's a whole raft of psychological evidence that suggests that. And many of the things involved with craft practices of using things well and repeatedly over time perhaps can reduce the impact of consumption. And the hope that we have is that cultivating these skills, getting people mindfully aware of what's involved, will also go a step further and also help reduce the desire to consume in the first place. So there's an economic historian whose work I think ties very nicely into some of the points that Susan was making. His name is Avner Offer. He used a phrase called commitment strategies that I think is very good at helping us understand some of these things that are going on. So he was trying to describe the forces that help us balance our short-term desires with long-term security. So these commitment strategies for the future help us to sacrifice something now for the sake of something better later. And maybe they help us forego the demands of me now in order to benefit long-term shared societal objectives or community objectives and goals. So in the past, there have been these commitment strategies which were things like self-control and prudence and personal rules that certainly worked in the past years, certainly to reduce people's levels of consumption. But as with all commitment strategies through time, these have been shown to wane, and what we need to do is to invent new commitment strategies that help us somehow figure out how to balance this taking of needs. So how do I balance my needs for me now, that screaming desire I have as me as an individual, for my long-term security? And so things like mindfulness have arisen relatively recently as an opportunity to help us get into this space of figuring out how we can engage with less. And now I think actually there's an opportunity for craft in terms of particularly lots of the things that Susan was talking about and skills around craft and using things to add to this, to try to figure out a way how we can make better decisions for the long term and also serve our needs now. So I was at a conference, actually a craft conference in San Francisco a decade ago at least, and an incredibly brave student stood up at the end of this 4-day conference, and it had been a conference which had people singing a cappella and making glass work. It was just, exquisite objects. And there was so much of this work that was on show. There's so much volume of it. And this student stood and sort of said, but there's so much of it, and where is it all going to? And can actually craft, she didn't quite put it in this way, can craft become a route to a sense of enough, and what does that mean? And I suppose there are very few concrete answers to this, but I would say that it seems that many people are already engaging with this in a very loose way without it being a thought-through process. But people already realize that if we're going to engage with some of these very challenging ideas, some of the skillfulness, some of the ingenuity, some of the thinking through making helps give them a clue to where that might be. I would also say that perhaps what craft does best is help us to engage, to embrace the complex, wonderful world we have, not retreat from it. And therein lies the solutions to many of the sustainability challenges that we face. And to do so with craft skills, I think is both pragmatic and it's also profound. Okay, so on that note.